That was the story I told you.
Yeah, the concession stand is open before the show begins. So we can go in there and just like flowers. Did you like the flowers?
Can't hear.
Did you like the flowers? Oh, you did? Oh, wow. Yes, oh, look at what we got. Where'd you put them, at the back door up there? Oh, there you go. I'll go look. Yeah. Oh, I bet they will. I bet it will. They will have more inside.
We fussed so much.
That's on
She said, okay, we won't have to do it.
Well, welcome everybody. We've got a little bit of a late start tonight, so I'll go ahead and get started with a few announcements. Welcome to the October meeting for the Kennedale Historical Society. This is our last one for 2024. Just some housekeeping. There's refreshments over here. There's restrooms down the hall and to the left if you need. And we're going to go through a couple of announcements. Thanks in part to a Tarrant County Historical Society grant. We've got 28 Kennedale High School yearbooks being scanned in New York right now. I just got word yesterday that they're going to be finished with them next week. So we'll be getting all of those back and returned to the high school and the administration building and whoever all we borrowed them from. And we'll be getting those put online for everybody to be able to see.
Yay.
So that's great news. Also, just a reminder, I think everybody was here last month just about that, and probably heard this, but we dropped off the first several years of the Kennedale News papers, and they're going to be added to the portal to Texas History on a trial run. Once I get the link and the confirmation that they've been added online, we'll be sharing that on our Facebook, and we'll probably do an email blast and share it on the Kennedale News and everywhere. We'll get the city sharing it, because the more people that go and look at that, the better it'll be for our chances to get a grant to fund the rest of the newspaper digitization as well as the photo board. So hopefully that'll be online and available sometime before the end of the year, and we'll blast that out once we get it. Just a reminder, our website is Kennedale Historical Society 2011.wordpress.com. We've got lots of cool stuff to check out on there. Our YouTube channel, we've put all of our lecture meetings on YouTube, so you can go back and catch any that you missed. Last month we had a great meeting with Dr. Sam Haynes, his book Unsettled Plan. So you can go and check that out. It is on YouTube. Like I said, there's not any meetings for November or December, but we are going to have the historical marker dedication ceremony at the Methodist Church. So do you want to say when the date is and all that, Lori?
November 10th, it'll be at 3 p.m. That's a Sunday afternoon. Everybody is invited to come. We're so proud to get it.
So that'll be a real good special event for the Methodist Church, which has been around for a long, long time. So long time coming. Oh, there it is. I had it to the next thing. January 16th, this will be our next meeting. We're going to take a trip to UT Arlington to see their special collections library. So be sure to email us, kenhist@live.com, to RSVP so that we can plan who's coming. I think we're going to try to get a school bus, and we'll just all meet either here or at the library, and we'll go together to Arlington, and it'll be a great outing, a great event. They've got a lot of really neat things you'll want to see, from an original copy of the Texas Declaration of Independence to the Fort Worth Star Telegram papers of the UFO sighting in Roswell, New Mexico. They'll have a lot of cool things out, including the Oliver S. Kennedy papers, who Kennedale is named after. So I'll have them pull those and we'll see that. We still haven't got anything on the books yet for February and March, but we will let you know when we do. And in April, we're going to be welcoming Dr. Thomas O. McDonald, the author of Texas Rangers, Ranchers, and Realtors, to talk about his book. You won't want to miss that. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Ron Tyler, the author of Texas Lithographs, A Century of History and Images, his newest book, and he's going to tell us about that. And he's got some of them for sale, and he's got some of his previous books for you to look at as well. So, without further ado, Dr. Ron Tyler.
Thanks, Doug. Without the portal to Texas history, I couldn't have done this book. It happened during COVID, so I had hours at home, and I consulted the portal for literally for months on end. So I'm really delighted that you're putting your newspaper on that source, because it's one that anybody who's interested in Texas history has to depend upon. I apologize for my hoarseness. We went and got our COVID booster a couple of days ago, and this is what I am doing in recovery. So it doesn't hurt as much as it sounds like it would. This is a project that began at the Amon Carter Museum in 1986, which was our sesquicentennial year. And we had a small exhibition there. We wondered if we could have a small gallery about this big for Texas lithographs. And we found enough lithographs to fill a small gallery. And I continued researching the project after the exhibition came down. And this book is a result. It has about 450 illustrations in it. So I found a lot of Texas-related lithographs after our exhibition was presented. And that's what I'll share with you tonight. There are really two stories. One's very brief, and that is the technology story. Lithography was a new form of printing that was invented or discovered, depending on your point of view, in 1798. The other story is the story of what I consider to be iconic Texas century, the 19th century. Think about all the things that happened in the 19th century. Stephen F. Austin establishing his colony in Texas, the Texas Revolution, joining the United States, the war in Mexico, the Civil War, Reconstruction, the coming of the railroads, the building of the cities. The 19th century is when it all happened, in a sense, if you will, and it certainly helped to establish our character. And it's one that we look back upon today, mostly with pride. This fellow, Alois Sinnefelder, a German, invented lithography. He told a story about working with a smooth piece of limestone, trying to print off of it, trying to draw on it, and then get reproductions off of that limestone. And if something happened, he was busy, he jotted down his laundry list on the limestone, and then later came back, and for some reason he was able to get a print off of it. So he thought maybe there's something to this, and he continued his research, and he ultimately developed lithography. And it was a revolutionary form of printing. In 1800, there were only 3 forms of printing on paper. One is relief printing, engraving. That's where the ink resides on a raised surface. You place the paper on it, run it through a press, and you get an image on your paper. The other method, which is quite old, was intaglio printing or etching. The ink resides in a groove. You press the paper on the groove very firmly so that it goes into the groove and contracts the paper. And then you get an image off of it. Lithography prints off of a smooth surface. It's also called chemical printing because it works because of the chemical reaction. And off of this smooth surface, you can draw, then you can put the paper on it, and you get an image. It's cheaper than engraving or etching. It's faster than either one of them, and you can get as many, some say more images off of lithography than either of the other two. Courier knives, for example, in the 19th century, advertised that they could get 250,000 copies off of a lithographic stone. I think that's impossible, but that's what they advertised, and they were the biggest printer in the 19th century. Well, pictures, and that's another story because lithographs are pictures. Pictures have a very important role to play in this story. The Quincy Daily Herald says the pictorial press provided a series of truthful representations of various points which afford probably a better idea of the lay of the land, the general appearance and characteristic of the country than is to be had from the most elaborate written description. So pictures are important if you want to know what the land looks like. And because of lithography, pictures are disseminated throughout the 19th century and had a great deal to do with immigration, particularly in a place like Texas. Just a suggestion of how important pictures are. In the winter of 1882 and 83, Charlie Siringo, who was born in Matagorda County, found himself in western Oklahoma with a group of 6 or 8 other cowboys, some of them illiterate. And they were bored. It was winter. They had nothing to do. And they decided that they would try to subscribe to a magazine to uplift their character, to help them become more educated. And they could have chosen from several different magazines. They could have chosen Scribner's Magazine, which was quite a good magazine at the time. And they could have also chosen Harper's Magazine. And we still see Harper's Magazine today. It's been around for almost 200 years. So what did they pick? They picked the Police Gazette, which was the sex, crime, girly, pinup magazine of the day. And Siringo was stunned. And he asked the 2 illiterate cowboys, why did you pick that wicked magazine? And they said, because we can read the pictures. So pictures really communicate, particularly across cultures, and of course, to people who don't read, they can still interpret a picture. So that's the role that lithography then plays in the history of Texas. So the 19th century then was the age of the illustrated press. Stephen F. Austin said, when I explored this country in 1821, it was a wild, howling, interminable solitude from Sabine to Behar. And indeed it was. At the end of the 19th century, a traveling salesman for the American Stationer said Texas is the only southern state which is fully imbued with the spirit of northern enterprise. So Texas is beginning to grow more rapidly than the other southern states. For one reason, Texas had not been invaded during the Civil War and didn't suffer the devastation that the other southern states did. At the end of the century, the railroad was the change agent. Texas had almost 10,000 miles of track by 1900. And when former President U.S. Grant visited Galveston in 1880, he said, Texas is an empire in itself. So within the space of less than a century, Texas went from that wild and howling wilderness to an empire in itself. And lithography tells that story. Here's the first Texas lithograph. In 1818, a group of French veteran soldiers from Napoleon's army come to Texas to settle, well, some say to settle, on the Trinity River. The settlement is called Champ d'Azile, and it was probably near Liberty, Texas. There were other French veterans in the United States. They had a settlement in Alabama called Demopolis. There were a number of them on the East Coast. They were forbidden from working on anything but the family farm after the French Revolution. So they had nothing else to do, so many of them immigrated. This settlement was a little different from the Mockers. This settlement was armed. And some people think that they were actually trying to set up a beachhead, if you will, to go into Mexico and take the silver mines in northern Mexico. Well, that might have been their purpose or not, we don't know. But it didn't last very long, because when they heard that there was a Spanish army on the way to drive them out, within a matter of a couple of hours, they packed up and decamped, went back to New Orleans, and dispersed from there. But in Paris, the settlers at Champs d'Elysees became a cause célèbre. The liberals who were anti-monarchist said, look what the monarchy has forced our brave French soldiers to do. They've had to immigrate and they're settled on the frontier and they need our help. So they published books, they published lithographs, they published maps, they held ceremonial dinners to raise money, and they actually sent the money that they raised to the mayor of New Orleans to distribute to the settlers around New Orleans, and he did, to all that he could find. So there are commemorative pieces, in other words, like this, that are a Champs d'Elysees, but they're actually published in France with the artist having no idea of what Texas is or looks like. But notice, they know they're on a river, but they've got boats out there. Well, are those boats to take them back to France, or are they to take them over to Mexico for that invasion? There are also rumors that they established this settlement because they intended to go to St. Helena and rescue Napoleon and have him lead their effort into Mexico. All kinds of rumors about this colony were flying around, and there were dozens of publications that came out in France it was anti-monarchy literature, is basically what it was. There are lithographic portraits of a number of people who immigrated to Texas, including Sam Houston, Lorenzo de Zavala, and Davy Crockett. Enough, there's no lithograph of Stephen F. Austin that was made during his lifetime. They were all made, these were all contemporary with their recipients. There were no artists in Texas during the Texas Revolution, but there were a number of images done by artists who didn't know what happened. I mean, this is supposed to be the Alamo, but if you ever seen like that, anything like that in San Antonio, I'm not happening. So they didn't know what the Alamo looked like, but they called it the Fall of Behar, or the Battle of the Alamo. This young man, though, didn't know what he was talking about. Joseph Chadwick was a former West Point student who had dropped out and gone to work with his uncle in his store in St. Louis. He became board of mercantile business, and so he went to New Orleans and joined the New Orleans Greys just as they were coming to Texas to help in the Texas Revolution. And he wound up stationed at Goliad. And this is the Presidio at Goliad. When Colonel Fannin found out that Chadwick was a West Point dropout, he assigned him the task of doing a map of the Presidio. And he did. In his last letter home, because he was later killed in the Goliad massacre, he sent his map, his drawing, and his parents sent it to New York and had it lithographed. Now, I only know of this one copy of the lithograph. It's extremely rare. But it's a very precise map of the Goliad Presidio. And there's a little, right there, that is John S. Brooks's 68 mounted musket barrels, which he had set up on a stand so that with a single match, he could ignite them and fire all 68 musket barrels. I don't know if they fired at the same time or if they fired in a location, but if anybody were to try to come through the door of the Presidio, they would meet Mr. Brooks's musket barrels. Another, well, this is 1837, after the Texas Revolution. It's a year after the Battle of San Jacinto, and the most famous artist, or perhaps even the most famous person, who came to Texas during this time was John James Audubon. He was working on his Birds of America, and he was almost through, but he had not made a western trip. He tried to get on several expeditions and failed, but he'd not gone any further than the Mississippi River. Well, now all of a sudden, he was given an opportunity to come to Texas, and he took it. He came to Galveston on a cutter. He and his son and a companion, traveling companion, landed in Galveston, spent some time in Galveston. He comments, this is April of 1837, the Mexican soldiers who were captured at the Battle of San Jacinto are still being held prisoner on Galveston Island. He visited the San Jacinto battleground and collected skulls, which he sent back to his friend Samuel Morton at the University of Pennsylvania, who was compiling a collection of skulls from people around the world, because he was doing research on the size of the cranium and the size of the brain. He was doing racial kinds of research, and the skull collection is still at the University of Pennsylvania. So Audubon was looking for birds, and he said he didn't find any new birds in Texas. And he knew that was a major flyway, and that gave him the confidence, he said, to go back to London and finish the Birds of America, because he really felt like he had pretty well gotten all the birds of America. He hadn't, he missed a few, but others would help him later on. This is a picture of, I managed to shut off my pointer. This is a picture of his son, John Woodhouse Audubon. He was with him on that trip. And John Woodhouse Audubon came back to Texas to do this picture of the rabbit after they started working on Audubon's second big publication, which was the Biological Spotted Birds of North America, all of the animals. Well, in 1844, there was another visitor to Texas, and that's Matilda Charlotte Ferris Houston and her husband, who was a former British military man. They came with their own schooner with a large staff, including armed people and a medical doctor, and there were cannons on the schooner. So everybody assumed that they were undercover representatives of the British Army. We don't know if they were, but that's what everybody assumed. Perhaps he could have just been wealthy enough to afford his own boat. They stayed in Galveston and Houston primarily because it was the rainy season and they couldn't get anywhere else. There were no roads. It was nothing but boggy mud in every direction from Galveston and Houston. And Houston, of course, when Audubon was in Houston, he said it was so muddy that when they crossed the street, they got mud up to the tops of their boots. Ms. Houston, though, when they got back home, wrote a book called Texas and the Gulf of Mexico, 2 volumes. This is the frontispiece to volume 1. It's a picture of the harbor at the city of Galveston in Texas, and she wrote a delightful book about her time in Texas. Look what happened to that picture of Galveston. It was copied in Mexico, it was copied in Germany, it was copied in the United States. Each one varies a little bit, you can see, but they all go back to her picture, because that was what was passed around. Same thing happened to the picture of Houston. These 2 images of Galveston and Houston, up until the Civil War, probably were what people in Europe would have seen if anybody asked them about a picture of Texas, because that's what was being circulated. Well, 1844, the question is Texas statehood or no. It becomes a presidential issue. So you see the candidate, Martin Van Buren there, second from the left, being prodded by his sponsor, former President Andrew Jackson, saying, stand up to your lick log, Matty. And the lick log, of course, is the handsome name being held aloft there by John C. Calhoun and another fellow. That represents Texas. That's the issue that he was being forced to face. And over on the right-hand side is James K. Polk and his running mate, Dallas. And Polk says, what do you say, Dallas? That's not the handsomest lady I've ever seen, but that $25,000 salary, which was the presidential salary at that time. Polk resolves the issue. He takes the Texas issue and pushes it, and of course, he won the election. He became the first dark horse candidate to be elected president. The big issue was slavery, of course. That was what was keeping Texas out of the Union, and it was never resolved until the Civil War. And if you notice that on the right here, right by the shoulder, is some print that's fading out, and the print says, "The Star of Freedom is fading." This man represents, of course, could be an overseer or just a multiracial figure. On first glance, you might think he's sitting on a bale of cotton, but when you look closely, he's not. He's sitting on a black man whose wrists are manacled. It's a powerful anti-slavery statement. And Texas almost did not get admitted to the Union because of the question of slavery. President Tyler resorted to a resolution rather than a treaty. It should have been a treaty because Texas was an independent nation. So was the U.S. It should have been a treaty, but it wasn't. Texas accepted the resolution and was admitted to the Union. And slavery was the issue. And you can see in my caption up there how slavery increased in Texas after it was admitted to the Union. Well, the Mexican War breaks out right away, and this is a picture by Daniel Powers Whiting of General Taylor's army at Corpus Christi. President Polk sent Taylor to Corpus Christi to establish a camp and then move down to Brownsville and ultimately into Mexico. It's a beautiful picture of the camp. Where the tents are located, if you remember driving into Corpus Christi, you come off the highway and make a big sweeping turn, that's right where the camp is located. It's called number one in the Army portfolio, number one. He intended to do number two. And his commanding officers liked what he was doing so much that they gave him release time to do pictures of their campaign into Mexico. And so he came back home and went to the lithographic shop to get his pictures reproduced. But here's what he found. He said the numerous exaggerated and spurious illustrations of a cheap character had sated the public curiosity. Somebody beat him to the punch, in other words, with imaginary pictures of the war. And so he put his pictures back in his portfolio and went home. One of the best pictures, though, coming out of the war was this picture by Carl Neville. And it's the introductory picture of George Lucas Kendall's book on the war between the United States and Mexico. Kendall was the editor of the New Orleans Picayune, and he had gone to Mexico and joined with the American Army as they invaded Mexico. So he was, what's the word they used today? Encased almost with the army. Yeah, thank you. And there are a dozen pictures of this quality in that book. It's a large book. So it's the picture of the Battle of Palo Alto, which is the first battle of the war. Now, how many of you have been to Brownsville? It's a national park site today. Did you see any mountains while you were there? No, it's pretty flat. That's where Musk is shooting off his rockets today. Neville has mountains in the background. And I think maybe the reason he did is because he was looking at this picture, which was published right before this book came out. And you see that line of trees on the horizon, which Neville, unfortunately, might have interpreted as low mountains. And so he enhanced them a little bit in his art. Well, meanwhile, back in Texas, German immigration has begun. Because in 1845, Prince Solms Braunfels read the Cabin book talking about immigration to Texas. He forms a company, the Adelsverein, to bring German settlers to Texas. They got a grant from Texas and brought German settlers into that area. This is that picture of Houston that came out of Miss Hausman's book. You can see it's not quite as realistic as the one from Galveston. It probably comes from a passage in the book talking about, she's talking about getting off the boat and climbing up a high cliff to get into the city. Well, if you're in Buffalo Bayou, there is a little cliff that you have to climb up, or there was at that time. It's pretty well level now. So the artist just, continued the cliffs like this. Very unreal. There it is, realistic realist picture. But this picture too was copied and sent all over Europe. Castroville. Theodore Gentils, a draftsman, or surveyor and artist, comes to Castroville with Henry Castro as a colonist, and he does a picture of Castroville as well as a map. You can see the river tree line here echoed in his map. Gentils lived in San Antonio into the 20th century and did hundreds of pictures of the San Antonio area. This is New Braunfels. This is one of the first settlements that the German colony established. And this picture was made by an artist named Rordolph, who had come to Texas representing a museum in Germany to collect specimens for the museum, but he soon left that job and started working with the Adelsverein, and unfortunately was killed in a gunfight near Round Top. So he did not live to see his picture published, but the members of the Adelsverein took his drawing and sent it back to Germany to have it lithographed because they knew it would help them bring immigrants into Texas. Carl Wilhelm von Rosenberg lived in the Grange for a short time, and I think he did this picture of Round Top. He also did this picture of the Capitol in Austin when he was working for the State Land Office. And he worked for the State Land Office for several years and hired several different German artists to work for him in the Land Office because they were really good at making maps. Karl Iwanski went to New Braunfels and then San Antonio. He did this picture of New Braunfels from the same perspective that Rudolph did his picture, but not nearly as panoramic as Rudolph's picture. The site is now where the museum is in New Braunfels, if you've been there. Hermann Lundwitz, one of those artists who came with the German settlers. Dr. Ernst Kapp had a water cure for a resort in Comfort, Texas, and he hired Lundwitz to do pictures which he could use as an advertisement for his spa, if you will. And wonderful pictures of all the things that you can do while you're at the spa, including reading your newspaper while you're sitting in the tub. Lundwitz also did this beautiful landscape of Fredericksburg. You can see the young boy watching the sheep, but over here is that famous church in Fredericksburg, which has been rebuilt. And the second version of it is there today. He also did this picture of San Antonio, which is kind of interesting because it shows the Alamo from behind. It's going right here. It's the Alamo from behind after it's been taken over by the U.S. Army to use for their supplies. So they put a new roof on it, and they put the little crown on the facade too, which wasn't there when it was being used as an addition. This is an interesting view of Indianola, and all these pictures are made before the Civil War, 1860 here. Helmut Holmes was a sailor on one of the ships that called at Indianola. Indianola, you may remember, was wiped out in a hurricane in '86. So it was still in its heyday at this time. A number of ships called in there. And you can see the American flag on this one. On the copy of this lithograph at the San Jacinto Museum, the flag is a Texas flag. And on the copy of the lithograph in the Hayden Carter Museum, it's blank. So the artist left it blank to be filled in at the owner's discretion. So, and there's another copy of the Library of Congress that seems to have blue and white stripes on it. It's very interesting. It appears to be blue and white stripes. And a pre-Civil War picture of Galveston. And there are some buildings you can recognize. St. Mary's Cathedral is definitely one of them. Galveston really was the city in Texas at this time. It was the city in Texas until it was wiped out, until it was humbled, if you will, by that 1900 hurricane. And it's very important in the story of lithography in Texas. Well, the person who tried to set up lithography to begin with was Wilhelm Tiedepapi, one of the German immigrants, an engineer, a very talented man. The publishers of the San Antonio Zeitung wanted to establish a lithographic shop, so they hired Tiedepapi to do it. And Mr. Due, who was the editor, said Tiedepapi was a brilliant man, and he virtually reinvented the craft of lithography with a manual in one hand and a press in the other hand. This is the first lithograph that he published. It's a caricature of Sam Houston. At this time, in 1855, Houston had associated himself with the Know Nothing Party. One of the important platforms of the Know Nothing Party was anti-immigration. And of course, German immigrants would not have been anti-immigration. They were also against slavery by and large, although some of them did own slaves. So he's got a caricature of Sam Houston, and he lists all of the problems with Sam Houston. He's a drinker, got wine there, all his sins are on his arm, temperance journal, slavery, multiple marriages. So it's a caricature out against Sam Houston, who later, of course, changed his views. This is the second lithograph he published. This is the only known copy of it. It's an 1855 map of San Antonio, and you can see it's had a rough life. He also published this letterheads in which he did drawings from nature for the top lithograph of the letterhead. So that's a beautiful little picture of the main plaza of San Antonio with the San Fernando Church, which later became the cathedral in the center. At the same time, 1850s, Texas now has been a state for a few years. The United States has sent troops in to protect people on the frontier. But they also sent in some people who explored various parts of the state. They said that nobody knows the source of the Red River. It's a very important river that forms much of the boundary of Texas. We need to know the source of it. So Randolph Marcy took an expedition up the Red River in 1852 to try to find the source of the Red River. He settled on these falls. He called it Kechiakichono, which is an Indian term. That's Tool Canyon and Tool Falls, and that's probably not it. That's one branch of the river, but another branch of the river goes into New Mexico, and that's probably the real source of the river. But they did some beautiful illustrations of Texas, sort of brought the whole idea of American landscape painting in miniature, if you will, to Texas. The book was so popular that it was reprinted in Hungary a few years later. And you can still see the same little figures with the falls there. On the Rio Grande, William H. Emery led an official survey to establish the new boundary between Texas and Mexico, or the United States and Mexico. After the war, of course, Mexico ceded what we call the Mexican Cession. So they were marking the boundary from San Diego to Brownsville. And when they got to El Paso, the city of El Paso not yet established, this is the church and plaza in what is today Ciudad Juarez. And the artist on the Emery expedition was Arthur Schott. Schott did a lot of landscape, but he was most interested in the Indians and in the plants, because he believed that the Indians were very closely related to nature, and that they had a sense that we do not have about the plants, and the plants understood. And you can see the plants are pointing toward the man or leaning toward the man. Same is true in this picture by Schott. All the plants seem to be attracted by the man. And we know this is true about Schott because we have his correspondence that accompanied these pictures. He's writing to his sponsor at Princeton University, explaining how the Indians had this sixth sense, if you will, this natural sense that the plants understood. And he was very concerned about how his pictures would be lithographed, because in the process of printing this lithograph, he would send in an original painting, and then a lithographic artist would copy that painting onto a lithographic stone backwards. And then when you printed off of it, it came out the right way. It's like in a mirror. So he was very concerned what would happen in that process. And he asked the government if he could come back to Washington and supervise his lithographs. And they said no. So they didn't want any interference. Another expedition across Texas, this time looking for a good route for a railroad from Memphis to San Diego, was the Gray Survey. And this is a picture of what he called Cathedral Rock, which is Guadalupe Peak to us today. And of course, it's a national park site. And here's the survey as they crossed the Pecos River. With water that depth, the Pecos would have been a very dangerous stream to try to cross. Well, the Civil War started, of course, in 1861. And Mr. Elliott did this picture. This was General Scott's plan for how to deal with the Confederacy. Blockade the Confederacy, cut off all their trade. But notice how he personifies Texas, a slave owner shooting his slaves as they, I guess, try to run away. So Texas' reputation is still based on slavery as far as the number of people are concerned. There are very few survivals on the Civil War in Texas because paper was a shortage. Some newspapers resorted to printing on wallpaper or very small sheets of paper. This lithograph was done by a man who was a prisoner, a Union Army prisoner at the Confederate Camp Ford near Tyler. And he did a picture of the inhabitants of the camp and various activities. He also hand wrote the old flag, hand lettered it, and then he had these lithographed after the war and shared them with all of the prisoners that he was able to keep in contact with, sort of as a souvenir of their time at Camp Ford. Well, Civil War's over, Reconstruction in Texas. Texas is readmitted to the Union, but it's an ordeal. And this caricature sort of illustrates that. This cowboy has a big sword, and on the sword it says, "For Reconstruction." And in his left hand, he's got an extra large bottle of old vodka. And his pistol and his spurs are even larger than his sword. So Texas is an unruly place to say the least. Edgar Gregory understood that. He was so fearless in opposition or danger that I sent him to Texas, which seemed in 1865 to be the post of greatest peril. The post of greatest peril, because Texas had never been conquered. Texas had not been invaded. Texas had not been humbled, if you will, like most of the other southern states. And so there were a number of people out in the fringes on the frontier who had been outlaws. They were draft dodgers, they were deserters, and just outlaws. There was a quote I love in the history of Bell County by George W. Tyler, no relation. He said, "The frontier is alive with outlaws making carnival on the frontier." And that's what was going on in Texas during Reconstruction. If you read the newspapers in the Portal to Texas history, you will see violent acts throughout the Reconstruction period. And some of our best-known feuds come out of that period as well. Flake's Bulletin in Galveston, the largest circulation newspaper in Galveston. The war has educated the class of men into idleness and into a familiarity with deadly weapons that prompts them to resort to the revolver whenever it suits their drunken vagaries. And the St. Louis Globe Democrat, in Texas, the life of man is held in a little higher esteem than that of an ox or a horse. And President Chester Arthur later talked about an armed group of desperados known as cowboys. So that's the reputation that Texas quickly develops after the Civil War. And many people began to turn it, of course, to take advantage of it and use it in advertising and in song. This is an interesting one to me on the left here. The Range Canning Company is advertising their boiled mutton with a longhorn and a cowboy, not a sheep. So the cowboy image really does take off. This is just an example, invitation to the cattle ranger's ball in northwest Texas. But the real change agent for Texas in the 19th century was the railroad. And you can see it in every part of the state. Now, at the same time, a lesser-known development is taking place. Miles Strickland, a stationer who was a Canadian, came to New Orleans, got in business there, moved to Galveston and bought a stationer's shop in Galveston. And in 1868, he added lithography. And here's a picture of his building, Strickland Stationer Lithography and Print. But as the Galveston Daily News points out, the enterprise was not properly appreciated. Texas wasn't ready for a lithographer, probably because of the distances to be covered. There's no way to have the critical mass at the center. But here's one of their advertisements, Strickland and Clark. They do invitations for the Mardi Gras in Galveston, but Panic of 1873 virtually wiped them out. The prolonged financial crisis felt a staggering effect upon Mr. Strickland. Hayes wrote a 2-volume history of Galveston for the 19th century. And Strickland had to sell his lithographic press. But he recovered. He got back in business, he got another press, and he was able to begin his lithography business all over again. He published this large wall map of Galveston Island. He started printing Mardi Gras invitations again for the Galveston Mardi Gras celebration. These by a very interesting artist named Henry Moser. His father was in Galveston designing the Cotton Exchange building, so he was in Galveston for a year or two and did some work for Strickland, which he actually signed as the artist. He did the beautiful little drawing of the Galveston Wharf in this lithograph. This is the lithographic stone that remains in the Rosenberg Library in Galveston. And this is a proof print taken from that stone. Very rare survivals of this business. And he continues to do Mardi Gras invitations, letterheads, illustrations for a newspaper. This is a bird's eye view that shows the damage of the Great Fire of '85 in Galveston. But Mr. Strickland died in 1882 of smallpox. His son tried to run the business for a while, and unfortunately it went bankrupt and was acquired by Clark and Quartz. Clark was the former partner of Strickland and Clark. He's now with Mr. Quartz, who is a good salesman, and they formed Clark and Quartz, which becomes the largest printing firm in the South, doing business in the Caribbean, Central America, and even as far west as New Mexico. Clark and Quartz even trademarked the Texas flag. And here's some examples of their work. Their business existed until I think the 1950s, and the Clark and Quartz building still stands in Galveston with the Clark and Quartz sign out front. It has been turned into condominiums. In Houston, W.H. Coyle was the largest lithographer there. And in Dallas, it was the Dallas Lithographic Company, doing work like this, the Dallas Courthouse, an advertisement for a brewery, and this bird's eye view of Dallas as a seaport. Remember, this was the time when they were trying to make the Trinity River navigable. They actually had a dredge boat going up and down the Trinity, trying to clear out all the logs and things and make it navigable. And they managed to get a boat called the Harvey all the way from the Gulf up to Dallas once. I don't know if they made any more trips than that or not. But in this bird's eye view, they have made a turnaround in Dallas so the boats can turn around and go back to the Gulf. This, of course, was done as a promotional piece for that effort, needless to say. This is an example of Fort Worth Printing, Texas Printing and Lithographic Company. This is the frontispiece to a book by William Dunn called The Evolution and True Light. And it's an odd little book. It's a combination of an autobiography and a Sunday school book. and just stories that are supposed to uplift you. And the frontispiece is a marvelous piece of work, I think. Obviously, it's heaven and hell. This, I guess, is God talking to Adam and Eve over here. And I guess this is the devil preparing the apple tree. But there's nothing in the book that relates to the frontispiece, so I'm guessing. Lithography ultimately spread to every major city in Texas, I think with the exception of Austin and El Paso. And it didn't go into Austin because Austin skipped the lithography phase and went straight to photo engraving. But ultimately, in the latter part of the 19th century, you get all kinds of very colorful advertisements relating to Texas, and many of them still coming out of Galveston. And here's what happened in Galveston, of course. The 1900s hurricane virtually wiped out the city, and they had to start from scratch in many cases. This is what happened to lithography. Halftone printing. Halftone printing uses a screening process to create gradations or shades. And they can actually then reproduce a photograph, which lithography could not at this time do. They couldn't work out a way to put the photograph on the stone and get it reproduced. So halftone printing really sort of makes lithography relegated to the cigar box maker, the printer of theatrical posters, or the publisher of promos and comic prints. This is Joseph Pennell, artist, well-known artist, saying that lithography is off the board at the present time. Well, that might have been the case in 1900 when he was writing, but it wasn't the case, of course, because lithography became the main form of printing in the world, really, in the 20th century. Not printing off of a stone, but printing off of a metal plate. They put a metal plate around a cylinder and got lots of prints off that metal plate, and thousands of copies if you wanted. This was the main form of printing color images up until computer graphics. And for example, do you know how they get the M on the M&Ms? Lithography. There they are. Also, lithography, or photolithography in this case, is used in the creation of computer chips. So lithography is still very much with us today. And it had a lot to do with getting us here. Herman Spies, in 1847, says the printing and distribution of such pictures would do more to lure immigrants than newspaper articles. So, if any of you are editors of newspapers, take that. Thank you very much. If you have any questions or comments, I'd love to.
I do have a question. I'm not sure I understand the process of lithography. They have to take the picture that somebody painted and put it on the stone backwards.
No, they would have to, another artist would have to copy it
He would
backwards.
literally copy
You
it.
literally copy it backwards on the stone.
How in the world did they ever learn to do that?
They're very skilled.
That's amazing.
That's all I can say. They're very skilled. When you get, for example, when you get two different lithographs, say a book goes through more than one edition,
Yes.
and maybe you have to recreate the lithograph for the second edition, it's very interesting to compare them because there are going to be differences. The same artist might not have done it for the second time. But that's what, you have to copy it on the stone backwards if you want it to read correctly when you print it.
I find that amazing.
I just think it's magic. It's chemical printing. It's based on oil and water do not mix. So when you get the image on the stone, you wet the stone, the ink is oily, the ink repulses that water, but the stone absorbs it. Put your paper on it, the ink will print, but the water doesn't. So it's a chemical magic as far as I'm concerned, and it's much more complicated than I'm saying. I have watched lithographers work, and I still don't know how they do it. It's very complicated.
I mean, that's interesting that you could tell, you could tell the history through these photos, but I find it almost more interesting in the process.
Well, the process is fascinating. When you get the drawing on the stone, you have to fix the drawing. So you have to put a chemical on it that, so it won't smear. But it doesn't ruin the absorption. Then you make it wet, then you put the ink on it, and then you get the print off of it. And you can do that multiple times, thousands of times. So it was revolutionary. And that's why we have all these pictures. Otherwise, it would not have been as easy to make those pictures. And then when you get the color lithography, if you're going to reproduce a painting, for example, there would be a person called a chromiste who would look at the painting and determine how he would do it. Because each color requires a separate stone. Because you're not mixing colors. They can't mix the colors at this time. So the chromiste would decide, okay, we're going to do the gold tint, then we're going to do green, then we're going to do, whatever order he decided. There's one very famous set of stones that still survives. A little painting. There are 32 stones that were used to produce that painting. Each one a slightly different color. And get them in register? Yes, that's a problem. When you're looking at chromolithographs, for example, if you look under a magnifying glass, you can see in many cases when they're not in register, where the colors overlap just a little bit, or don't quite fill the image because they're out of register. It's a difficult process.
How talented were those people?
Yeah. Well, most of those lithographers during the 19th century were imported from Europe. This process was worked out mainly in Germany, because that's where it was invented. And Strickland brought his lithographers in from Germany and England, because nobody in this country knew how to do it. And the Lois Sennfelder wrote a book on how to do it, but I guess some people would say he left out the most important parts. He wrote a book about it, but you have to experiment yourself to figure it out. And any master printer would have his way of doing things, and he would not share except with people who were working for him. So it became very important then for lithographers to migrate. If you can hire this guy away, then he can bring their secrets over here for us. They were trade secrets that were held very closely. And any handwork like this, particularly chemical work, is an enormous trade secret. But they did manage to produce some really beautiful pictures. They really did. And even the chromolithographs, Audubon, well, not Audubon, but his sons, Audubon was dead, reproduced half of the birds of America by chromolithograph. And some of them were quite good, some of them were out of register. When I first saw Audubon chromolithographs, I thought, boy, those are really inferior. But then I saw some good ones later on. It would be kind of hard to tell the difference. Because when they finished a chromolithograph of Audubon's quality, then there would be a finish where you would come in with paint and touch it up where it was needed. Because Audubon's work was highly skilled. And he was above his artist. Anybody else? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Will you tell everybody about the books you brought?
Oh, sure. Of course, I've brought 2 copies of Texas Lithographs. The cost of these books is $60. This is the book that I did before, The Art of Texas, and it's out of print now. They're going to reprint it, but for the moment it's out of print. And then this is the first book I did after I retired on Western art and Western history. And this is a book that I did over 50 years ago on the history of the Big Bend. This is a revised edition, it's $20. And I'm just delighted to have a book that's not quite as old as I am, but been around for more than 50 years.
Well, we thank you for coming and presenting.
My pleasure.
Yes, very much.
That's why I was coming to do, turn the light on.